The crisp white envelope felt like a burning coal in my mother's hand. I watched it arrive. The weight of it, the precision of Veronica's movements, as she placed it on the mahogany table like an offering at an altar. 2 tickets. Alaska. I had just spent the last 20 minutes listening to her voice crack with theatrical desperation about the crushing financial burden of the trip. The second ticket, she'd said, was simply impossible. My name is Julia Hartwell, and I'm 35 years old. I'm a forensic accountant, the kind of woman who can reconstruct entire financial histories from fragmentary documents and who understands the world through the language of numbers, ledgers, and the careful arithmetic of truth. I'm also the kind of woman my family has spent my entire life describing as too analytical, too quiet, and frankly, not much fun at parties. Veronica didn't meet my eyes as she passed the envelope across the polished surface. She never does when she's done something cruel that she's convinced herself is actually kindness. Instead, the envelope went directly to my older sister, Aurora, 4 years my senior, infinitely my superior in the hierarchy of our family's affections. Alaska, Aurora gasped, her voice climbing into that register she reserves for moments of profound delight. She clutched the tickets like they were lottery winnings, like they were the keys to a kingdom she already believed she deserved. Mommy, you're too much. A 10-day cruise. Wesley has been so stressed with the business. This is exactly what we need. Wesley, her husband, a man whose inherited wealth was being systematically dismantled by a series of increasingly catastrophic business ventures. A man who had never, in the 8 years I'd known him, met a bad investment he didn't immediately throw money at. I stood rooted to the spot, my coffee growing cold in my hands, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger yet. Anger would come later. This was something quieter, something more dangerous. Clarity. I thought, I said carefully, and I was proud that my voice barely wavered, that we couldn't afford a second ticket, Mom. You said the cruise was pushing your budget to the absolute limit. Veronica turned to look at me. Then, her expression was a masterwork in the art of maternal pity, the kind of look a saint might give to a beggar she decided not to help. Behind it, I could see the calculation. How to make this sting in a way that wouldn't seem intentional. We couldn't, dear, she said softly. And frankly, your anxiety and your little budgeting worries would just ruin Aurora's rest. She needs this break more than you. You've always been perfectly happy with your solitary work. Aurora smiled directly at me. Then, a sharp, triumphant crescent moon of satisfaction. The message was crystalline and unmistakable. I was too much trouble, too complicated, too small, and too utterly unimportant to merit even a shared memory with the sister who mattered. I was in the mathematics of our family, a rounding error. The hot flush of shame crept up my neck like a living thing. I recognized it immediately, that familiar, agonizing sensation I'd been carrying since childhood. The feeling of invisibility, the knowledge that I would always be the footnote in someone else's story. I forced a slight, polite smile, the kind that costs every calorie you have, and excused myself quietly. I walked out of their pristine house, past the Aubusson rugs and the carefully curated art collection, out into the Virginia afternoon. I drove back to my lonely rental apartment in silence, my hands steady on the wheel even as something inside me was transforming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk in the dark and pulled out the old papers relating to my inheritance. Everything I'd tried not to think about for a decade. My father, Elias Hartwell, had been a man of immense wealth and even greater foresight. He had also loved me with a fierceness that bordered on protective, as if he'd recognized early on exactly what kind of family he'd created, and had determined to build fortifications around his youngest daughter's future. He died exactly 10 years ago. A heart attack, clean and sudden, the way he would have chosen if he'd been given the option. His will was extraordinary, not just in its complexity, though it was Byzantine enough to make estate lawyers sweat, but in its fundamental philosophy. Elias had believed in contingent trusts and staggered asset transfers, in golden handcuffs and safety mechanisms designed specifically to thwart predatory behavior. He had seen the world clearly, my father. He had understood people in their fullness, including his wife's hunger and his elder daughter's entitlement. I remembered a conversation I'd had with my father's lawyer years ago. It had seemed so obscure at the time, buried under tax implications and technical language. But I had understood one phrase clearly: 10-year trigger clause. The house, the Haven, was not fully settled. My mother had remained as a life tenant, which meant she lived there, controlled it, drew certain benefits from it, but didn't own it. The biggest asset in the estate, the beautiful, sprawling Victorian mansion I'd grown up in, was programmed to transfer into my complete and legal ownership exactly 10 years after Elias's death. That deadline was 7 days away. I sat in the dark of my apartment and felt understanding crystallize inside me like diamonds forming under pressure. The pieces that had never quite fit suddenly aligned with perfect, terrible clarity. The cruise wasn't a vacation. It was an alibi, perfectly timed, 10 days long, beginning in 4 days. They were leaving the country to ensure they were legally inaccessible during the precise window when the Haven's deed would automatically and irrevocably transfer into my name. But they had no intention of letting that happen. I could see it now, as clearly as if they'd spelled it out for me. The sale would happen while I was helpless and powerless on the other side of the country, unable to stop it. Veronica and Aurora would rush through a fraudulent transfer of the house into Wesley's name, or perhaps into one of his shell companies. Within days, the property would be sold, millions of dollars, liquid and clean, flowing directly into the accounts of Prestige Ventures, Wesley's increasingly desperate business entity. They needed that money. Wesley's latest venture had failed spectacularly, and something about the way he'd been acting lately, the tight jaw, the phone calls taken in hallways, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was watching, suggested they needed it urgently, possibly to pay off people who weren't the forgiving type. The sale of the Haven, my emotional anchor, and the one thing Elias had truly left me, would solve all their problems. The realization hit me with the force of an electric shock, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had been their victim for 35 years, but I was not going to be their victim now. I pulled out my phone and started the clock. 4 days to the cruise. 7 days to the trigger. 3 days to figure out what Elias had left me. I had always been the methodical one, the one who could follow threads through labyrinths, who could reconstruct truth from fragments. It was time to remember who I was. I went back to the Haven the next day, using the excuse of watering the plants. It was the kind of thing I'd volunteered to do 100 times before, the kind of task that wouldn't raise a single eyebrow. Veronica and Aurora were in the sunroom, shouting instructions at the housekeeper, debating luggage arrangements and whether champagne would be cheaper on the ship or in ports. They barely glanced at me as I moved through the halls. I slipped into my father's old study, a room they'd mostly left alone over the years because it was too musty and still smells like his pipe tobacco. The walls were lined with books he'd loved, first editions of mysteries and philosophy, detective stories, and essays on human nature. There was a leather wingback chair where he'd sat reading late into the night. And there, in the corner near the window, where afternoon light fell in golden slabs, was the grandfather clock. It was beautiful, mahogany, heavy, intricately carved, the kind of piece that might have come from a Victorian estate or an antique dealer in England. The face was decorated with pale blue porcelain and delicate gold filigree. The pendulum was brass, perfectly balanced, and it swung with the kind of rhythm that could hypnotize you if you let it. I remembered my father teaching me to wind the weights when I was 12. He'd shown me how the mechanism worked, how small adjustments to the escapement could shift the entire rhythm of the device. The truth is always in the rhythm, Julia, he'd said, and I'd thought at the time he was being poetic, philosophical. Now, I wondered if he'd been leaving me a message encoded in metaphor. My hands were steady as I opened the side panel where the weights hung. I reached in and carefully loosened the ornamental brass plate on the clock's face, the one that framed the center of the dial where the hands moved. Behind the plate, hidden in the narrow space behind the minute hand's axle, was something that made my heart stop. It was a tightly rolled piece of paper, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. The paper was old, creased with age, but the handwriting was unmistakably my father's, precise, elegant, methodical. The first thing I saw was a date, 1998, the year Elias had created the Core Trust. Below that, in miniature font printed on what looked like standard paper, was a Python script. It was complex, far beyond anything typical, lines of code spiraling down the page like an incantation in a language I understood better than English. And there was a note written in Elias's hand. Feed this into the old server. The truth is in the Shell Corporation records. I stood very still, holding the paper carefully, as if it might disintegrate if I breathed on it. My father had known. Somehow, he had known that this moment might come, that his family might prove itself predatory enough to warrant such precautions. He had left me not just money and property, but a weapon, a tool, a key. I carefully photographed the script with my phone, zoomed in on every line until I had a perfect digital copy, and placed the original paperback behind the brass plate. I closed the clock's side panel and wound the weights back to their proper position. The pendulum swung on, marking time with perfect precision, keeping the rhythm to a world my father had left behind but had never quite abandoned me to. I knew exactly what server Elias meant. He'd kept a small office in an industrial storage unit across town, a place that held the physical and digital remnants of his life before he'd retired to manage his wealth more carefully. A place that Veronica and Aurora knew nothing about, because they'd never cared enough to ask about his life in any dimension that didn't involve money they could access. I drove to the storage facility the next afternoon. The old server was exactly where I remembered it, a small, dusty machine that had been sitting offline and silent for years, covered with a cloth that had accumulated more dust than memory. My father had left detailed instructions in a file I discovered during the initial probate process. Keep the storage unit maintained, keep paying the fees, keep the equipment in case it was ever needed. He'd even set up a separate account for it, one that continued to pay automatically, drawing from funds that had nothing to do with the main estate. My father had been a man who understood the importance of insurance. I connected the server to a secure network I'd established using a virtual private network and an anonymous account. My hands were precise as I uploaded the Python script from my photographs. The script loaded cleanly, and I gave it a name, audit_map_v1. Then I waited. The code was genius in its simplicity. It wasn't a hack, nothing illegal, nothing that would compromise any systems. It was an audit algorithm, exactly what my father had called it. It didn't break into anything. Instead, it cross-referenced transaction data against timestamps, purposes, and patterns. It mapped shell corporations, traced the movement of money through accounts, and flagged anomalies that would instantly reveal systematic fraud. But it needed one critical input: the Heritage Trust's full transaction database. I knew that Aurora kept her company's financial records on a cloud service tied to her private email. The Heritage Trust wasn't technically her company. It was an investment vehicle she and Wesley used, but Aurora was scrupulous about one thing: keeping detailed records. It was her nature to document everything, to have proof of every transaction, every decision. She liked having ammunition. She just didn't think anyone would use her own weapons against her. I couldn't break into her account. That would be illegal, and I needed to stay clean. What I could do was something far simpler. Predict her. Aurora's passwords were always the same, in structure and content. They were based on vanity and status, on the things that made her feel important and superior. I spent the evening at my apartment making lists. Every vanity plate she'd owned or dreamed of, every designer purse brand she mentioned, every milestone year she considered important. Then, on a hunch, I drove back to the Haven one more time. The family had left that morning. I'd watched them load the limousine, watched the driver pull away. The house was silent and empty in that particular way that only happens when inhabitants leave for a long time. I found what I was looking for in a junk drawer in Aurora's dressing room. An old personalized keyring, the kind she'd carried in her early 20s before she'd decided such things were tacky. It was leather, hand-tooled, and it had 3 initials engraved on it. AWL. Aurora. Wesley. Luxury. I stared at it for a long moment, understanding in that instant that my sister had probably chosen those letters with complete seriousness, that they probably represented some genuine belief about her life and its components. I went back to my apartment and tried the password, AWL 2008. The year they bought their first luxury car, a Range Rover, if I remembered correctly. There had been a celebration about it. It worked on the first try. Aurora's cloud storage opened before me like an unlocked door, and I felt a strange mixture of emotions, satisfaction, certainly, but also a kind of melancholy at the sheer predictability of her self-obsession, the way she'd coded her most important secrets in the language of things that mattered most to her, initials, years, status symbols. I downloaded everything, 3 years of financial records, 3 years of transactions. I uploaded the database to my father's server and ran the algorithm. The results came back in less than an hour, and what I read made me feel physically ill. They hadn't just used my inheritance. They had systematically stolen from me with a methodology that suggested planning and deliberation. They had sold off assets from my trust, non-liquid investments, small holdings, the kinds of things that wouldn't raise immediate questions, and they had funneled the proceeds into Aurora's and Wesley's personal accounts. But here was the brilliant part, the truly sickening part. They had recorded these thefts as business losses for Prestige Ventures. They were committing blatant tax fraud, using the systematic destruction of my financial future as a tax shelter, claiming losses they hadn't actually incurred, reducing their tax burden by tens of thousands of dollars per year. I was not just their victim. I was their unsuspecting accomplice on paper. The algorithm flagged it all, pulling thread after thread, revealing the architecture of their theft with mathematical precision. There were wire transfers with timestamps. There were shell corporation accounts, some of them buried 3 layers deep. There was evidence of money laundering, legitimate-looking business expenses that were really personal purchases, artwork sales that weren't sales at all but transfers of assets between accounts designed to confuse auditors. But the most chilling discovery came when I dug into the recent documents in Aurora's cloud storage. It was a legal document, cleanly drafted, professionally formatted, with all the hallmarks of having been prepared by a competent attorney. It was a power of attorney, granting Wesley the authority to sell the Haven on Aurora's behalf while she was abroad. And it had my signature on it. Or rather, a forgery of my signature, done well enough to pass casual inspection, but not well enough to withstand forensic analysis. The document was dated to be executed the day before the 10-year deadline. The sale was scheduled to close in exactly 3 days. I sat back from my computer and tried to breathe normally. I had known they were planning something, but seeing it documented, seeing their intent crystallized in legal language and criminal intent, was something else entirely. This wasn't improvisation. This was premeditation. They had planned to steal my house. They had prepared forged documents. They had set a timeline that would have left me legally powerless to stop them. And they thought they would get away with it because they thought I was the kind of person who wouldn't know how to fight back. I didn't call the police. That would have been too emotional, too loud, and too easily dismissed by Veronica's smooth lies and carefully constructed narrative about my instability. I didn't call a lawyer. The law moves slowly, and they were moving fast. My revenge had to be surgical, quiet, and federal. It had to exist in a system they couldn't charm their way out of, couldn't dismiss as the paranoia of a troubled sister, couldn't overcome with money and connections. I packaged everything. The raw data, the forensic algorithm's complete output, the forged power of attorney documents, the records of systematic theft from my trust, the evidence of tax fraud, and money laundering. I created a presentation that was clear, logical, and irrefutable. And then I called the one person I knew who could weaponize it. Dr. Eleanor Elms had been one of my law professors in my paralegal certification program, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for having brought down some of the most sophisticated financial criminals in the country. She'd left academia 5 years ago to become a federal prosecutor specializing in complex financial crimes and tax evasion. Her conviction rate was legendary. I had kept her email over the years, never expecting to use it, but somehow knowing I might need it someday. I sent her a message marked urgent and requested a meeting. She met me at a quiet coffee shop in Arlington, a place where no one would recognize either of us. She was exactly as I remembered. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of stillness that comes from having seen the absolute worst of human nature and having decided it would not surprise her anymore. I presented the evidence without naming my family, referring only to subjects A and B and perpetrator C and the shell corporation Prestige Ventures. I laid out the systematic nature of the fraud, the evidence of tax evasion, the forged legal documents, the timeline. Dr. Elms read through the audit map I provided, her eyes widening incrementally with each page. By the time she finished, she was leaning back in her chair with the expression of someone who just watched a magic trick performed by a master. "This is remarkable," she said quietly. "The mathematical precision of it, the documentation. Why haven't they been caught yet?" "Because they've been moving slowly," I said, "and they masked the income streams using a recently purchased high-value asset, a family home, that they plan to liquidate quickly. The sale was scheduled to happen in 3 days. After the sale closes and the money is distributed, the crime becomes much harder to trace." Dr. Elms set down the documents and leaned forward. "You understand what you're asking me to do?" "Yes," I said. "I'm asking you to investigate them. I'm asking you to stop them. And I'm asking you to do it quietly." "I can do the first two," she said carefully, "but I can't stop a legal sale of property without a civil court injunction. And getting one of those will take time you don't have. Civil court moves slowly, and your case, while strong, would be contested." I had expected this. I had prepared for it. But Dr. Elms continued, tapping her pen against the table in a rhythm that reminded me of my father's grandfather clock. "We could use the sale itself as evidence. If the sale happens, if the money transfers, we have the moment of intent captured. We have proof of the crime in action." She was silent for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, following threads, understanding the elegant solution that was already forming. "The buyer," she said slowly. "The sale proceeds." "Who's the buyer?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but the sale is scheduled for 3 days from now. The proceeds will transfer to an intermediary account before going to the seller." Dr. Elms smiled, and it was not a kind expression. It was the smile of someone who had just understood that she was going to win. "Leave this with me," she said. "And Julia, the sale will happen. But when it does, I want you to understand exactly what you're setting in motion." I had one more piece of work to do, and it was the most delicate part of all. I went back into Aurora's cloud storage, careful to cover my digital tracks, leaving no evidence of my access. I found the power of attorney document and studied it carefully. It was comprehensive, the kind of legal document that covered every contingency, that anticipated every possible complication of the sale process, including wire transfer instructions. I created a digitally altered version of the document, changing only a single element in the boilerplate language of the wire transfer instructions. It was subtle, a small technical error in the routing code that would ensure the proceeds of the sale were routed to an intermediary account, an account I couldn't see or control, but an account that Dr. Elms had quietly set up through the IRS. It was the kind of error that would be invisible to anyone rushing, anyone distracted, anyone who wasn't reading every single line. And they would be rushing. Wesley's panic would ensure it. Veronica's desperation would guarantee it. I re-uploaded the altered document to Aurora's cloud storage, replacing the original file. Then I waited. The day of the closing arrived cold and bright. I stayed home and tried not to watch the clock, though of course I couldn't help it. My phone was silent. No messages from Dr. Elms. No indication that anything was happening at all. But I knew it was happening. I could feel it the way you feel a storm approaching, in the pressure of the air, in the vibration of the world shifting. At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It's done. The buyer took possession. Funds transferred as directed. Stand by. The buyer was an FBI informant working undercover for Dr. Elms' team. They had selected him months ago, apparently, the moment I'd contacted Dr. Elms and provided the evidence. He'd posed as a developer, legitimate enough to pass scrutiny, interested enough to move fast, prepared enough to close on short notice. The Haven was officially sold. The proceeds, millions of dollars, the clean money extracted from my stolen inheritance, were wired exactly where I had directed them, to a federally monitored account that the IRS had flagged and frozen the moment the wire transmitted. The sale had created the evidence. The money's movement had activated the legal machinery, and my family, thousands of miles away on a cruise ship, celebrating what they thought was a perfect crime, had just walked directly into a federal investigation. Aurora texted me while I was still sitting at my kitchen table, staring at nothing. "So sorry you missed out, Julia. We're having an amazing time. Oh, and I had to use your old storage unit key for some emergency paperwork. Hope you don't mind." Smiling face with smiling eyes. My hands went cold. I pulled up the storage unit documentation. I checked the access logs, and there it was, a record of someone entering the unit that morning using the emergency key that Aurora had somehow found, probably in a drawer at the Haven. She was a snoop, had been since childhood, knew where all the important things were hidden. The storage unit had been accessed. Someone had been there, but they hadn't found the server. They had been looking for the deed to the Haven, for documentation of my ownership, for something they could use to challenge my claim to the property. What they'd found instead was an empty space and layers of dust. The server was gone. I'd removed it the day before, just in case. My instinct had been right. But more importantly, Aurora's message was a confession of intent. She'd needed the key for emergency paperwork. She'd accessed the storage unit for some emergency paperwork. And she was doing it all while on a cruise ship, while supposedly unreachable, while building her alibi. I screenshotted the message. I forwarded it to Dr. Elms with a single line. They went to the storage unit. Her response came back immediately. "Perfect. Proofs they knew about your assets. Proofs they were trying to locate documentation. Proves premeditation." Wesley called the closing agent at 4:13 p.m. I found out about it through Dr. Elms, who had contacts with the title company. Wesley was frantic, screaming, nearly incoherent. He needed the sale money released immediately. Immediately, there was a problem, a serious problem, and if the money didn't transfer, he was going to lose everything. The agent, following Dr. Elm's instructions, cited minor federal auditing delays due to the complex business structure of the sellers. Professional language, polite but immovable. The money would be released, but there would be a brief hold while documentation was verified. Wesley lost his mind. He called Aurora on the ship, the conversation apparently so loud that the surrounding passengers could hear him screaming. Aurora called Veronica, and then, in a decision that would ultimately seal their fate, they decided to take action. They emptied their personal travel funds. Tens of thousands of dollars in jewelry they'd brought to purchase, in ports, luxury shopping money, emergency cash they'd brought just in case. And at 8:46 p.m. ship time, they wired all of it back home to a shell account, attempting to bribe the closing agent to release the funds. It was a desperate move, sloppy, panicked, and completely traceable. The wire transfer was flagged the moment it went through. The money was traced directly back to a known shell company linked to Wesley's prior fraud from before I was even born, apparently a pattern of behavior that had simply continued and evolved over decades. Dr. Elms had her final piece of evidence. Wire fraud, conspiracy to obstruct a tax investigation, the complete picture of a criminal enterprise spanning years. The sealed federal warrants were issued quietly, efficiently, and without fanfare. 2 warrants, one for Aurora, one for Veronica. The charges were specific and devastating: tax fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, forgery, and fraud. The warrants were timed perfectly. They would be executed the moment the cruise ship docked in Miami, when Veronica and Aurora would be unable to flee, when they would be vulnerable and far from whatever legal resources they thought they had access to. Dr. Elms didn't tell me the exact time. She just said, "Go to the airport. Watch them arrive. I thought you'd want to see it." I drove to Miami International Airport at dawn on the day the cruise ship docked. I parked my modest sedan across the street from the arrival gate, in a spot where I could see the terminal entrance without being obvious about it. I had dressed carefully that morning, neutral colors, nothing memorable. I had combed my hair. I had put on the kind of face that blended into crowds, that didn't stand out. That was exactly the kind of face someone like my mother had taught me to wear my entire life. The passengers began to arrive at 10:47 a.m. Aurora stepped out of the terminal first, tanned and relaxed, and absolutely dripping in new, expensive jewelry, pieces she'd probably purchased in ports, paid for with credit cards that would be frozen within days. Behind her was Veronica, carrying shopping bags from a high-end designer, looking exactly like a woman who'd just spent 10 days convincing herself she'd gotten away with something. They looked triumphant. They looked smug. They looked utterly satisfied with the ruin they had created. I watched them walk into the main terminal, saw them begin to look for their ride, saw the moment they were distracted, thinking about luggage and champagne, and whatever luxury awaited them at home. That was when 2 figures approached them. They were not police officers. They were not dramatic or loud. They were polite, impeccably dressed federal agents in dark suits, one from the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit and one from the FBI. They moved with the kind of quiet authority that comes from handling sensitive matters in public spaces. One agent showed Veronica a badge. The other quietly and professionally handed her a sealed envelope. For a moment, nothing happened. Veronica stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. Aurora, being Aurora, scoffed with the kind of confidence that comes from having never faced consequences in her entire life. "You must have the wrong person. We've been on a cruise." The young female federal agent. She couldn't have been more than 30, with cold, analytical eyes and the kind of stillness that suggested she'd seen this exact scene play out before, responded with zero emotion in her voice. "We're aware of the cruise, Ms. Aurora. It was very convenient for the transaction. She then calmly listed the charges: tax fraud stemming from years of systematic theft and false reporting, conspiracy to commit wire fraud relating to the recent wire transfer attempt, wire fraud itself, conspiracy to obstruct a federal tax investigation, forgery of legal documents, and fraud. She linked every charge directly to the evidence: the sale of the haven, the forged power of attorney, the falsified wire transfer instructions, the desperate bribe money sent from the cruise ship, the years of stolen assets, and fraudulent tax claims. The color drained from Veronica's face. Her shopping bag slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the airport floor, spilling designer boxes and tissues. Aurora screamed. It was a sound of pure, entitled terror, the sound of someone who had never truly understood that consequences were real, that they applied to people like her, that the world operated according to rules she couldn't charm or manipulate her way around. Passengers stopped and stared. Airport security moved closer, watching but not interfering. Apparently, Dr. Elms had coordinated with them as well. The agents placed Veronica and Aurora under arrest with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow made it worse. They read them their rights in neutral voices. They explained that they could make a phone call, but that anything they said could and would be used against them. By the time they were escorted away, I was already walking back to my car. The ensuing months were a blur of legal disaster. The sale of the haven was voided. The property reverted to the Unified Asset Trust, the umbrella entity created by my father, which now passed fully and legally into my ownership. I was no longer a secondary beneficiary. I was the sole owner, outright and absolute. The proceeds of the sale, millions of dollars, were seized by the IRS to cover years of back taxes, penalties, and interest accrued by Prestige Ventures and its associated entities. Aurora and Veronica faced both civil and criminal penalties. Their assets were frozen. Their reputations, which had been built on such careful curation, shattered overnight. Wesley, faced with the reality of what he created, did what he always did when things became difficult. He disappeared. He left the country and sent Aurora a lawyer's letter explaining that they'd grown apart and that he was pursuing new business opportunities elsewhere. Aurora faced the charges alone. The trial lasted 4 months. I attended every day, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching my mother and sister confront the architecture of their own crimes. The forensic accountant who'd reviewed the evidence testified for 3 days, taking the jury through the mathematical proof of their theft, the systematic nature of their fraud. The prosecution presented the algorithm I'd created, or rather, that my father had created decades ago, anticipating exactly this moment. They explained how it worked, how it had caught the criminal enterprise that Aurora and Veronica had been operating with such confidence and such fundamental belief in their own invulnerability. At one point, Aurora's lawyer tried to claim that the algorithm was inadmissible, that I had obtained information illegally. But the evidence had been obtained through legal means. Aurora's own cloud storage, accessed with her own password, which she had left for me to guess on a personalized keyring she'd carelessly left behind. The algorithm itself wasn't evidence. It was merely analysis of evidence that was freely obtained and properly admitted. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Aurora was convicted on 5 counts: tax fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and obstruction of justice. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Veronica, though her role was less direct, was convicted on 3 counts: tax fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. She received 5 years. Wesley, by the time his assets could be frozen, had already dispersed most of his money. But the federal government was patient. They would find him eventually. I stood in the foyer of the Haven exactly 1 year after Aurora and Veronica's arrest. The house looked different now. I'd had it restored, carefully, respectfully, keeping Elias's essential character intact while making it mine. The Aubusson rugs had been cleaned and repositioned. The artwork had been curated according to my preferences, not my mother's. And the grandfather clock still stood in my father's study, its brass pendulum swinging with perfect, unfailing rhythm. I listened to it chime the hours. The sound was pure and clear, a heartbeat marking time in a way that had nothing to do with desperation or fear or the need to escape. My forensic accounting firm had expanded dramatically over the past year. I was working exclusively on federal cases. Now, cases that came to me through Dr. Elms, who had become something like a friend. We had coffee regularly. We debriefed about cases. She told me that my algorithm had become famous in federal investigative circles. There were other copies of it now, deployed in other investigations, catching other criminals who thought they were too smart, too connected, too important to face consequences. The house felt alive in a way it never had when Veronica lived in it. I had furnished my father's study with comfortable furniture. I had hung paintings I actually loved. I had made it a space that reflected Julia Hartwell, the woman who had spent 35 years being told she was too quiet, too analytical, too boring, and discovered that the things my family had criticized were actually my greatest strengths. The quiet, analytical mind, the careful attention to detail, the ability to see patterns others missed, the willingness to plan carefully and execute patiently, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. These weren't character flaws. They were weapons. 2 years later, on a gray November afternoon, I received a letter from Veronica. It came through my lawyer, who flagged it as something I probably wanted to read. My mother had been released early for good behavior. She would finish her sentence under house arrest, confined to a government-appointed apartment, her assets depleted, her life a carefully reduced existence. The letter was brief. Julia, I've had considerable time to think about the choices I made, the way I treated you, the lies I told myself about you and your father. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't expect anything from you. I wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what you did, and I understand that I deserved it. The things your father left you, the care he took to protect you from us. He understood us far better than we understood ourselves. I'm sorry. That's all. V. I read the letter twice, carefully, analytically, the way I read everything. I filed it away with my other important documents. I didn't respond. There was nothing I needed to say to her. The verdict had been rendered. Justice had been served. The rhythm had been restored. That evening, I played a piece of music my father had taught me to love, a Chopin nocturne, on the piano in the front parlor. I was never particularly talented at it, but I loved the sound of it, the way each note moved into the next with the inevitability of time passing. The grandfather clock chimed 9 o'clock as I played, its rhythm perfectly synchronized with the music, as if Elias had arranged the timing from beyond the grave. I thought about what the family had said about me over the years. Too analytical, too quiet, too boring, too small, too unimportant, not enough of anything that mattered. And I thought about what Elias had known all along, that quiet minds can be dangerous, that analytical people see patterns, that patient people can wait for exactly the right moment to act, that the things the world dismisses can be the very things that save you. I was still quiet, still analytical, still the kind of person who preferred books to parties, who understood the world through numbers and patterns rather than emotions and social performance. Still, in many ways, exactly the person my family had always said I was. The difference was that now I knew what those qualities actually meant, and I was not ashamed of them. I had never needed to be. The grandfather clock chimed the next hour, and the next, keeping perfect time, marking the moments of a life that was finally completely, authentically mine. And I understood what my father had tried to tell me that day in his study so many years ago, watching me learn to wind the weights and adjust the escapement wheel. The truth is always in the rhythm of patience, the rhythm of observation, the rhythm of justice, which moves at its own perfect pace, inevitable and unstoppable as time itself. I had trusted the rhythm, and the rhythm had saved me. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. Your worth isn't defined by their seating chart or by who they choose to believe first. My story proves that silence can be a weapon, and patience, true, cold forensic patience, is the ultimate power. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's been gaslit into invisibility. Tell them, your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Subscribe and hit that bell for more stories about setting boundaries and turning humiliation into triumph. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. Your worth was never in question. It was only waiting to be remembered. Have you ever had to prove your worth to a family that underestimated you? Share your experience below.